Kenyan tribunal has halted plans to construct the country's first ever coal-powered plant near the coastal town of Lamu. The five-bench judge cancelled the license previously granted to Amu Power, the developer of the controversial Lamu coal plant. According to the tribunal, authorities in the East African nation failed to do a thorough environmental assessment. The judges also faulted Kenya's National Environmental Management Authority for failing to conduct public participation. Environmental activists in the country have been pushing for the government to focus on setting up clean energy. However, just last week, the Kenyan government condemned critics of the power plant, terming them as enemies of progress. Now, Odaga is a Kenyan advocate of the High Court, and he's also the senior program officer at the Nairobi Hub of Natural Justice, one of the firms that litigated this case. He's here in studio to put everything into perspective for us. So, Mark, pleasure having you in studio with us tonight.
Pleasure's all mine.
Walk us through the main highlights of that judgment. What faults did the court find with the environmental watchdog in the manner in which it handled the review of this coal power plant?
I think you've touched on some of it, yeah. But I'll just recap again. I think the first issue, correctly, as you've stated, revolved around the issue of public participation. Mm-hmm. And the essence of public participation in such development projects is to give communities, those who are likely to be most impacted by a certain project, to have full information, to be able to make informed decisions about whether this is something that they find is beneficial. And if they have concerns about their potential impacts, then to also submit to the regulator certain mitigation measures that can be put in place. Now, the tribunal pointed out that throughout the entire process, the community members of Lamu weren't given sufficient information. So this is the first coal power plant in the country. It's the first, if you leave out South Africa, it's the first in East Africa and the rest of Africa. So even for the project proponents, it's new. So community members are really relying on the project developer to tell them both the benefits, the potential impacts, and this includes, the associated infrastructure. How is this coal going to be delivered here? And from the evidence that was adduced before the court, there just wasn't sufficient information to show that this had been done. Now, without any access to information, then obviously the community members of Lamu couldn't make informed decisions, and the whole process therefore became a futile exercise. Now, secondly, the regulator also has a role to play. So it's not just for the developer to run this process. I think we have laws which prescribe the levels of effective participation which are required. So the regulator has to step in and make sure that at a local level, the developer has met its obligations. But beyond that, remember, this is a coal plant. It has far-reaching consequences. So that at a national level, everyone also has to be given ample opportunity to be aware of the full impacts of this project and to be able to give their comments. So that was the second aspect. What was also novel is that the court identified that for a coal plant in particular, there are climate change implications. And there was no evidence that these had been given consideration as well.
Right. So the court also pointed out that key information on the engineering details of the plant were not provided to the public. What else was omitted?
Precisely. So that was critical because, as I've mentioned, a coal plant has various components. Mm-hmm. Critical aspects of this include how you're going to deal with some of the waste, So there wasn't sufficient information, for example, on how far certain components that we're going to deal with, the fly ash, were going to be from the ocean. So what happens in the event of flooding? Have you put sufficient measures to make sure that then you're not releasing all this effluent into the ocean and polluting the environment? So that was a problem, and it then leaves the regulator in a situation where it can't really assess whether the mitigation measures are sufficient. Then you also had the fact that the project documents also didn't show that alternatives had been considered, particularly as regards the location of this coal plant. So the tribunal itself wondered how then the regulator could establish that Lamu and this particular place in Kwasasi was the best place for this plant to be located.
What did the court say about the economic viability of this project?
Well, the court said they can only address issues regarding the economic impact of the project, not the economic viability. And I think we have to appreciate that the National Environment Tribunal is a specialized court. So in terms of what it can consider, it's a little bit limited. It's meant to look at the process leading to the granting of an environmental impact assessment license. And they felt that when it comes to economic viability, that is potentially something that was beyond their scope, and so they really didn't touch on it.
Right. So to what extent did the court take into account the environmental damage that will be caused by burning coal once this project, of course, was on the air?
I think it's important to mention that the court noted that even according to the environmental impact assessment study that was submitted by the project proponents, there was a concession that there would be environmental impacts and public health impacts. You know, they cited that there would be respiratory problems, and then this also becomes something that you need to weigh. A lot of times, I think policymakers don't factor in these costs. They're called external costs. So that even if you're saying coal is relatively cheap, it might be in the short term, but in the long term, if you look at all the health impacts that flow from these plants, and this is a plant that's, remembered, has a life cycle of at least 25 years. So you need to factor that in, because then that comes back and someone has to pay for it.
Right. So then Amu Power will likely run through this EIA process yet again, but plans to build it have not been cancelled yet. So if they do get another EIA that meets the legal requirements, what are you going to do next?
Well, so there's a number of options. One, they have 30 days to consider whether they want to appeal against the judgment, so that's an option for them. But yes, given that the license has been cancelled, the only recourse then would be to start the process afresh. For the people of Lamu, I think they've made their voice very clear. They're not for this project. You know, for them it's an issue of pride in Lamu itself. It's delicate ecosystem. For the fishermen, their concerns about whether, you know, how this is going to affect their livelihoods. For the farmers as well, there's issues of, you know, the emissions from the coal plant and acid rain, which might affect the land. So for them, taking all of this into account and looking at, I think it's becoming harder to run away from climate change, you know, and it really is becoming a climate crisis. I think even locally and in Africa, we're seeing the impacts of this climate crisis, and that's also a concern. So for the people of Lamu, they'll wait and see what happens next, but I think they've made their voices very clear that they would prefer that this plant doesn't proceed. They're cheaper, less environmentally damaging options available, so there's no need to go down this path.
Mark, thank you very much for those insights.
Thank you.
Mark Odaga, a Kenyan advocate of the High Court, in studio with us.